part of political conversations in ways that we have been pretty disenfranchised from for most of American history. And then I host a podcast as well, which is pretty fun. I won't really talk about it today, but if you want to hear how humanists explore social issues and how people interact with the world from a humanist perspective, I think you would quite enjoy it. For today, I'll be using humanist and atheist kind of interchangeably. I identify as a humanist for my beliefs, but atheist, that is a atheistic worldview. And so atheism is the frame I'll use a lot of the time. And these are kind of my three goals when I think about the larger work that I'm doing. Apologize for the noise in the background. There's a little robot that cleans our cat litter box thing. Okay. There's three kind of focus areas we have for work when you think about work in the secular movement. You might hear this phrase every now and then, people who are leaders in humanist, atheist, or secular organizations. And these are often three of the most important values and goals, I think, if I had to synthesize my work and what I'm doing down to. And that is separation of government and religion. And that's ultimately because freedom of religion is not possible without also protecting freedom from religion. There's pluralism, so challenging religious privilege in all corners of our society, because pluralism is not possible when certain identities are valued above others. And then finally, it's critical inquiry, replacing dogmatism with critical inquiry and skepticism, because freedom of thought is a human right. And there will always be institutions and leaders that will try to force us to believe as they do. And we need access to tools. We need access to the tools that can help us resist those that will hurt us. So this is, again, big three. I'll probably come back to these in different ways throughout this. But when I think about framing religious privilege, power, and pain, and why atheists are often speaking up so often about separation of church and state. Almost every atheist community in the country has centered separation of church and state. It is because it is the only way to guarantee equity for all religious and non-religious identities. So let's do my story real quick. This cute little guy is myself in the early 90s, I think. I grew up in rural Massachusetts, about an hour and a half, hour outside of Boston, and I attended Catholic school in first grade. I think it was called Immaculate Heart Catholic School, and it was one of the only Catholic schools probably left in the country where we still did Latin Mass before school started, and it was wild being a first grader attending Latin Mass, and what a weird introduction to religion as a child. Now, a lot of children, like myself, are pretty resistant to being forced to go to a place often, listen to strange ideas and stories. And I was the worst of the worst for pushing back against religion, even at a young age. So in first grade, I had way too many questions, and the nuns immediately targeted me as the kid that just would not shut up with questions. And it's kind of a nuisance about how uncomfortable I was by, the uniform, of course, but then the religious services that I was forced to go to. And so by first grade, I started actually identifying with a lack of belief in God and not an appreciation or understanding of why these stories or ideas could be valuable to my life. And especially because I was contrasting them to science at the time. We had, for whatever reason, really good science classes. And I remember in first grade even understanding that this is a really good explanation for how the world works. And a talking snake just didn't do it for me. So I was clashing with, that was probably my earliest clash with religious privilege, and recognizing basically there is no option but Christianity for a lot of people as they grow up in America. What your parents believe or what school you go to has wild influence over your lived environment. It wasn't until I was 19 until I even realized there was a difference between Catholic and Christian. The influence, essentially, where you grow up and what you're told can have over you is wild. And I was lucky, though. I had parents that were quite nice and engaging whenever I had questions about it. So while I was able to somehow convince my parents to move me out of the Catholic school in first grade and move me to the public school, I think part of it being I later found out we had one of the best public schools in the country in that hometown. But they kept making me go to church. This was for the next few years. I was just the kid that complained every Sunday, kept going to church. And my best complaint, the best argument I had was Dad doesn't go to church. He watches football. My dad grew up in Southern California. He was not a big, especially Catholic churchgoer. My mom was from Massachusetts and grew up in the Roman Catholic tradition. And eventually, after annoying my mom so much about this topic, she made an ultimatum with me. She said, if you finish First Communion, I'll let you decide if you ever want to go to church again or not. And so I said, sign me up. I'm going to prove her wrong on this one. And I went through the whole thing. I got to carry the cross in. I think I even did it a year late because I was so pushy about the First Communion at the time. And yeah, I finished First Communion and never went to church again until I went to college. I thought this was the biggest win of my life. But what's fascinating is I didn't even discover the word atheist until at least, I think, 6th or 7th grade. I was hanging out. We had a free reading time in the back of the classroom. I went to the back of the classroom and started flipping through a dictionary. I was one of those kids that just said, I don't want to read the books they tell me to read. I'm just going to go poke through this big book. And I discovered this word atheist, which described a lack of belief, or I think the dictionary definition there probably had it wrong, which was a disbelief in God or gods. And I remember just this epiphany moment. There's a word for me. I have an identity. I didn't realize that I had spent so many years of my life actually identityless because I had not even heard of options other than Christianity or Catholicism. All right. I started to use that term. I realized kind of quickly that not everyone liked it. You get some stares using the word atheist. I don't know if any of you have tried it before or identify that way, but I encourage you to walk through a busy place and call yourself an atheist and see how people look at you. I learned this very young. There were a few people that immediately gave me some strange stares as I talked about my atheism, but I didn't know better. I really thought they maybe just hadn't heard of the term like I did, and they, were confused and they were curious what I was talking about. But I think they did now that I get to look back on it. But honestly, I'm lucky. I grew up in a town where the Unitarian Universalist Church was the largest church in town. Like, there really wasn't a conservative religious influence the way a lot of towns and cities across America made it really hard to be a non-theistic or non-religious individual. And so for the most part, I was able to move through society just fine. And then I did something funny. I chose to go to college at California Lutheran University. Out on the West Coast in Southern California. And this is what threw me into a totally different environment. And what I wound up doing within my first year there is founding the Secular Student Alliance at California Lutheran University. And what's interesting about that club, if you know anything about California politics, in 2007, 2008, the biggest thing happening was Proposition 8. This was the gay marriage law. We had passed gay marriage in California through the legislature, and then a group of conservatives had got a ballot initiative passed or on the ballot to where we could try to eliminate the law that had just allowed gay marriage. Proposition 8 became one of the most funded ballot propositions in American history. The Mormon Church, they argue that dumped in possibly over $100 million in dark money. And ultimately, the progressive side lost that, and gay marriage was overturned in California and again became illegal. And what happened though is my freshman year protesting with the Gay Straight Alliance on campus and all these other progressive communities, we noticed that all of the times we were out protesting and all of our frustrations when we came back and tried to recharge was around religion. We kept noticing that all of the arguments that were being made about why a group of people are not equal, about why they shouldn't have the same access to the rights everyone else did, always hinged on some religious influence or argument. And ultimately, I decided to ask everyone in the room, are any of you religious? And finally, it was really fascinating. About over half the room said, I'm atheist, or I'm agnostic, or I don't know, or I'm questioning, or I would love to talk to people who aren't religious. And that's what inspired me to found the Secular Student Alliance at California Lutheran University. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that group and what was so influential about it. But I really think what was fascinating to me was how people joined the group from such a radically different position than mine. When I created this group, I think I thought it would be a bit more of like an atheist philosophy space. I thought there'd be a lot of people like me who grew up atheists and just felt like you're living in this religious world, and maybe we could sit around and kind of like talk about the different critiques or ideas we have from a secular perspective of religion or institutions. But instead, it became this safe space. It became this home for people who were questioning religion for the first time in their life, who had religious parents and they did not feel safe or comfortable talking to them about the questions they had. They had religious roommates who they feared if they brought up that they were reading atheist literature or reading non-Christian ideas might be abused or harassed. And come to find out, I even had members of our group who were there on religious scholarships. Cal Lutheran had this matching scholarship program where if your church put up $2,000, the school would match $2,000. And ultimately, we found students who were attending my club were scared to tell their parents that they even were participants because they didn't want to lose their scholarship and have to drop out of school. These are the layers of religious privilege that influence why people can't even question openly in a lot of places in society. And to put in perspective, Cal Lutheran is a very progressive university compared to most religious schools around the country. The Lutheran tradition of higher education is about as pluralistic as it comes in the United States. And overwhelmingly, I felt extremely comfortable as an atheist on that campus. But I realized it takes time, it takes community, it takes confidence you have to build in order to be someone like me. And frankly, it takes privilege. And luckily, I come with a lot of other privileges. I'm a straight, white, cis male from a rich background. And so to speak about my atheism openly is not hard the way it is for a queer youth or a woman. So what's fascinating, though, is the club wound up being different than a lot of secular student alliance clubs around the country. We wound up focusing on what we didn't believe, all of these religions. We wound up focusing on what the intersection is between our belief and all of these traditions that have hundreds and thousands of years. And so what we started to do was we started to become as religiously literate as we possibly could and as diverse understanding. And so we started visiting religious institutions. We basically became the first interfaith club at Cal Lutheran, even though we were a bunch of atheists and agnostics and humanists. And so we started attending all of these different religious traditions and services. We would find Buddhist temples in downtown Los Angeles. We visited the largest Hindu temple on the West Coast out by Malibu. I found some pagans in Thousand Oaks who were part of our local Unitarian church after we'd visited the Unitarians, and we got to visit the neo-pagan ritual of Imbolc, which is kind of the coming of spring we got to attend. We went down to we started doing field trips. We decided to go down to San Diego, which was a 3 or 4 hour drive, and visited the massive, absolutely massive, it looks like a spaceship, Mormon temple down there, which by the way is great for photo shoots if any of you do go to San Diego anytime soon. We visited creation museums. We started exploring this full spectrum of religious diversity. I attended my first pagan festival, essentially. We did tarot card readings and tea leaf readings. And what's beautiful is you don't have to share the beliefs with everyone there for you to appreciate the culture they've built around them, the architecture that comes with it, the traditions and celebrations that make them who they are. And the way to do that from an anthropological perspective was so beautiful and completely changed my perspective on religion. Whereas a young kid growing up kind of critiquing and rebelling against a Catholic upbringing that I thought was just kind of painful and silly, I found that my interaction with religion could be beautiful and inclusive. even when we interacted with assholes like this guy. All right. But I did have some experiences that kind of remind me, though, that religion cannot and should not escape all forms of critique, though. And we cannot ignorantly enter interfaith conversations without holding true to our values. And one of the best examples of this for me was a visit to, this is a dual experience for me. It was probably one of the best cultural experiences I've ever had visiting a church, and one of the most intense challenge to my values. So we attended Simi Valley Second Missionary Baptist Church in Simi Valley, California. This is a Black Baptist church. I'd never been to a Black Baptist church before. And oh my, the music is incredible. If you've never been to a Black Baptist church, I highly recommend it. You know, there's a lot of people that dress up nicely for church. Nobody beats the Black Baptist churches at how well they dress, the music, the energy. I know that we sang for at least 2 hours that morning before any service started because I skipped breakfast before we went and was starving the entire time. And this experience, I just absolutely love. We had partnered with the Lutheran Club on campus, and the pastor of Cal Lutheran actually came with us on this experience. We had the Secular Student Alliance and the pastor at Cal Lutheran. She had known the pastor who runs the Baptist church here. I think went to seminary or college, met them at some point. And so this was going to be this really awesome, engaging experience. We were, I think, all white people that had attended. So it was like this massive intercultural experience for a lot of people. And I honestly thought this was going to be my favorite religious, I call them like interfaith adventures, my favorite interfaith adventure that I had been on. And until the service started. And what was frustrating for me is when we got towards the end of the service, which I didn't mind the sermon, I didn't mind the songs, I didn't mind the references they were making back to biblical stories. It's when the pastor started to offer support and advice and prayers for his community. And he asked people to come up to essentially his pulpit area, and he asked them to ask favors of God. And the first one wasn't that bad. It was, I think a man and a woman were complaining that they've been trying to make a baby and they haven't been able to have a kid yet. And they just need some help with that. And so they're asking for the pastor's prayers to help make that possible. And he's like, look around this room. There are multiple people that I have helped have children. You will not be the last. You know, God will help you have a baby. And, you know, my atheist brain's going like, okay, that's a little silly, but okay, I can get over it. The next one was somebody had lost a job and was looking for a job, and they were asking for God's help to get a job. And the pastor was like, absolutely, don't you worry, put your faith in God, you will find a job. Same thing. I kind of was like, okay, stakes aren't very high. I'm not too worried, you know, whether it gets a job or not. You know, my perspective is God's not involved, but it doesn't hurt for a pastor to necessarily say that. But this last one will stick with me probably the rest of my life. And it was a middle-aged mother who came up and she said, my son has leukemia. And she said, he's had leukemia for 2 years now. And about a year ago, he got really, really sick. And I took him to the hospital and the doctor saved his life. And I'm just so grateful they saved him. But it's getting really bad again. And we're really worried about his situation, but I don't trust the doctors anymore. And I want to know, will God save my son? And I just remember he got real quiet. He put his hand on her shoulder. She kind of put her head down. And he just said, don't worry about those doctors. Don't worry. God's going to save your son. There's nothing else you have to do. And I didn't know the age of the son. He could have been under 18. I didn't know the situation of the family and whether they would rush to a hospital if he got sick or not. But the fact that we could tell somebody to ignore medical science, to ignore our probably the most life-saving option because God will solve it. And you should distrust the professionals who have worked their whole life to figure out how to save a child in this situation because of religion or God. we can't ignore that that's dangerous in our society. We can't ignore that there are people that get hurt and die because of beliefs and choices like that. And of course, there's much larger examples like 9/11 or other forms of terrorism that have happened throughout our lives. But I really think this just hit home for me in a way that I never really had before, that we can't ignore that beliefs have consequences. They can't fully be separated from who we are. And while the way we design society, the way poverty, our upbringing obviously have other impacts, we can't go without questioning and challenging some of the ideas that happen in religious institutions and how they impact larger society and the people we care about. Okay. So let's just define privilege real quick. So I'm kind of jumping out of that. So Cal Lutheran was wonderful, had all these experiences, but I kind of have my own understanding of how I must think about religion, where it can be both this beautiful thing and something that can and does hurt people in some instances. But let's quickly dive into kind of privilege, because I put that in the talk title and what that means, and we'll go into some ways that that impacts us in society. So privilege, this is a very basic definition of privilege. Many of you have probably heard of white privilege. You've heard of male privilege, maybe. Privilege is unearned access to resources and power in society because of a social group membership. So a lot of these, again, like racial privilege, are the race you are born into, or if it's class privilege, it's the family and the class level you were born into. Unearned is the most important part of privilege, and why most people with privilege have trouble understanding that they have privilege. I'm hoping I don't have to spend a lot of time. There's tons of books and essays and videos you can watch about privilege. But I want us to start thinking about religious privilege in the United States and in the context of different countries around the world. And in the United States, it is without question, Christianity has the privileged position in our society. Since the European colonizers came to the United States and have held power over all peoples in the United States, they brought Christianity with them. That was a critical part of a lot of the settlers that came to the now United States. And to this day, it continues to be the overwhelming force and powerful institutions, whether it be our leaders, or the halls of power in our society. Even the definition of atheism has been influenced by Christian privilege, which is fascinating. I was looking up definitions of atheism before this talk just to make sure I had mine correctly. And atheism is a lack of belief in God or gods. Our community and its members have always defined it that as nothing more, nothing less. It is this lack of belief. It's not an active assertion. It starts from a rejection of this premise that there is a God and we must reject it. It starts from a place that I lack even the belief that I have to have conversation, that I am in response to a God or gods. And you'll notice that even if you look through old dictionaries, even some modern ones, they used to define atheism as a belief that there is no God. I mean, think about how monotheistic that is focused already. It starts from a premise that monotheistic religion is the privileged religion, in which case we need to respond to with atheism. Like all theism is defined by one concept of God. And we see this all of the time, right? When most Christians talk about in God we trust on our money, we know how uncomfortable they get if you switch that to in Allah we trust. It's my favorite, actually, if you want to really get a conservative Christian riled up. Just replace their word with Allah in any conversation. So let's talk about what that looks like in our society and as those privileged groups try to hold power through institutions. Again, I'm skipping over what, if I was an academic, I would write much longer essays on to kind of keep things moving. And I think the Q&A will be much more important. But one of the largest projects by the most privileged part of Christians in the United States is a project called Project Blitz. And this phrase Christian nationalism I want to talk about for a second. Christian nationalism is a pretty intuitive term if you have an understanding of what nationalism is. But Christianity we can't deny that the most privileged identities of Christianity, most privileged people and people in power that use Christianity as their identity and label have pretty much had that interconnected with American nationalism, with white identity, for as long as America has existed. And we need to have a strong understanding of this going into any conversations. There's intersectional aspects of this. And atheists and Muslims and Jews, like we don't magically escape this. There are influences of white supremacy and nationalism that still get into our communities just as easily. There are unbelievable European and colonial influences in a lot of our traditions. But Christianity, specifically in America, we do need to focus on, and especially Christian nationalism, because they have are weaponizing it and using it in institutions in a way like maybe we haven't even ever seen in U.S. history, which is fascinating. Now, America, in a lot of ways, was the first, most secular nation at its time when it was founded, right? We look at the ideals of the founding documents of the United States and celebrate how we established separation of church and state. Jefferson's wall of separation was such a ideal for the world for how we can keep religious power and influence separate from government power and influence, ultimately to protect minority religious identities. At the time, they were trying to separate the Anglican Church from other forms of Christianity, but really this is, I think, the most important value for protecting all minority religious identities and beliefs across the world, and why Christian nationalists are always working to chip away at that. If you can take the power and ideas you have and put them in the institutions of government, you have control and influence. And so Project Blitz is the newest project of Christian nationalists, where they are looking to attack LGBT rights, access to reproductive health care, religious equity. They're trying to redefine religious equity for themselves. And this is a huge problem. And organizations like American United for Separation of Church and State and American Atheists have been two of the leaders in pushing back against this. And then we've started to see a whole host of leaders in the United States government start to speak more openly about the intersection of their religious values and identities with the law. So one of the beautiful things about the American law system, and a lot of countries' law systems around the world, is secular law ultimately. Barack Obama gave a beautiful speech on this years ago. It was very much in the vein of the JFK speech from long before that. But essentially, in order to give all people equal access and opportunity with the law, we have to guarantee that it is secular. It doesn't matter what your inspiration for the law is. It doesn't matter what got you to the place where you believe this to be true and should be law. But if it can't apply evenly to all people, if it doesn't have a secular lens in which it can be, there's a secular mechanism for enforcing it, then it will not work for a pluralistic and secular society. And so ultimately what's fascinating is watching leaders frankly openly challenge that now. So we now have William Barr, we have Jeff Sessions, we have Mike Pompeo, and in some ways Trump with his modern rhetoric as he runs for president and is running further and further to Christian nationalists in order to get elected. We're finding that they're getting more comfortable and excited to kind of merge religion and government. And so Project Blitz, which I was just talking about, is a way to use state law. They're looking to chip away at laws in the states rather than the federal government in order to slowly get religion back into what they believe is its rightful state as the truest law of our land. Now, if we're to go international, this frankly gets much more intense. In the United States, while you, well, it depends. From an atheist perspective, we are not being thrown in jail because we are atheists right now. From a Muslim perspective, we do have immigration laws being completely designed around your religious identity. And I do think culturally, Jewish, atheist, and Muslim identities are being attacked and targeted at extremely high rates, including other marginalized and minority identities like Sikh as well, Sikh and Hindu. But what's fascinating is if we look abroad, the law has been intertwined with religious nationalism in much more dangerous ways. One of the best examples of this is Kamalia Kamala. This was a story about her a few years ago. She fled Bangladesh in 2015. She was an atheist blogger and writer. And she fled Bangladesh because 10 atheist bloggers, professors, and publishers were basically executed by public mob in Bangladesh at the time. A few of them were hacked to death by machetes in the streets. They were found in their homes. And to this day, she receives death threats and rape threats just for existing. So we can't deny that the challenges that come with having a non-privileged religious identity from the background you're from is literally life or death for a lot of people around the world. Humanist International is an international NGO that works to protect non-theists and non-religious people around the world who are in dangerous situations because of their secular or questioning perspective. They get hundreds and hundreds of requests from people around the world, often anonymously. Some are refugees trying to get out of their country. Some are facing jail. Some have been arrested because of their beliefs. And they put out a report every year. They just published their 2020 action report, which I highly recommend, which talks about the state of blasphemy around the world, talks about how equal some of the federal laws are, and ultimately about the persecution, both culturally and legally, of secular identifying people. While this focus is more on humanist and secular identifying people, this can be widely applied to other minority religious identities, and there are other organizations working in that space, like Amnesty International, that I highly recommend. But even based on their most recent report, I'll get to that in a second, they started to break down which countries even have laws and what the consequences are those for even questioning what the majority belief is in those countries. And in the case of Iran or Saudi Arabia or Pakistan, it's death. I mean, literally the talk I am giving to you right now, if I were to give this in Pakistan, I could be put in jail and killed by the government for. It's life or death to just share your ideas and beliefs. In Iraq or Bangladesh, that could be prison. And while prison might be the highest persecution in the law, often culturally it's much more dangerous. So what we find is death threats. You'll find that police will harass people who openly speak on these topics, and the dangers only get worse. One of the biggest examples, I'm heading the wrong way, right now that they're working on is president of the Humanist Association of Nigeria. His name is Mubarak Bala. 2014, he openly rejected the Muslim faith that he grew up in. And his father is a well-known cleric in the country of Nigeria. And what happened was local officials decided to arrest him, imprison him, drug him, and keep him in a mental institution until he said he was no longer a humanist and would identify as a Muslim again. It took legal action for months in order to get access to him and then get him out. And ultimately they did. And he wound up joining the humanist organization there in the country and became their president a few years later. And 100 days ago, he posted on Facebook, frankly, it was a critique of Christianity, but he related it back to the Prophet Muhammad. And so people took that as a critique of the Prophet Muhammad. And he was arrested in the middle of the night. I forget if it was day or night, but in the middle of the day, a group of police showed up and arrested him. Did not tell him what he was being arrested for. Officials in the humanist community later found out it was for cyber crimes relating to a Facebook post he had made. He was moved from the county he was arrested in into the county that he was previously held in 2014 and has him on record as. In that district, they practice Sharia law alongside secular law. We're hoping we can keep him in the secular law system, but if he were to move into the Sharia law system, apostasy is punishable by death. To this day, the lawyers in the humanist community have not been able to access him. It seems like the courts and the prison is blocking access to him. There's been no proof of life, and the community is kind of lost for words for what we can do, because Nigeria has strong secular laws on the books about not, giving due process to people, and religion being not a good enough reason to arrest people. If you've been following the news on Nigeria, they've had a growing Boko Haram problem and other terrorist-aligned radical groups. But yeah, this is the situation many humanists face in different parts of the world. Very different than what I face in America, but kind of a realization I have to have when I think about being a marginalized religious identity. So I'm gonna just kind of wrap this up by talking about these three guys on the left here. The fourth guy, actually, we just met up with in Hong Kong. That's Sam, myself, and a guy named Grant. We actually met in the Secular Student Alliance at California Lutheran University. We became best friends because of that group, and we made a pact that we were going to travel the world every 2 years after college, and we've been doing that ever since consistently. And one of the fun things we've decided to do is go out of our way to continue to explore religious institutions, religious icons, religious iconography, religious history. And so this was us in Hong Kong visiting the Big Buddha statue, which is pretty famous. This is us in Cuba visiting some church ruins above Trinidad, and we visited a few cathedrals there. In Morocco, we were able to visit the largest mosque in Africa. And it's just truly beautiful being able to continue this appreciation and engagement with religion while still holding these critiques. But I want to quickly finish with a story about Hungary. Hungary was my first time in Europe. And for those of you that have been to Europe and been in any old cathedrals or castles in Europe, it truly is an inspiring and momentous feeling being in buildings of this scale and this, frankly, opulence. And you can sit and wonder for a while, and the way the sound bounces off the walls is just so beautiful. And when we were in a smaller city, we stumbled into this church called Our Lady of Hungary in English. And it was undergoing renovations at the time. I don't even know if we should have gone in it, but we just snuck right in, under the scaffolding and through some things. And in this beautifully quiet, dark, echoey little church, and the light pours through these windows in this photo. It's really some of the most beautiful photos we took on that whole trip. We're just looking up at this stained glass. And I just remember kind of being able to meditate for a second in that church about religion and history. And because in the United States, you can go to an old church, but it's never like older than our country. Our country is really young compared to a lot of these cathedrals and churches in Europe. And I'm sitting there, and I'm on one hand admiring its beauty, and on the other hand trying to place myself in the world when this was built. I'm imagining the poverty. I'm imagining being gay. I'm imagining being a woman in these times when millions, frankly, of dollars were being spent to build these, unbelievable institutions that would hold up throughout time, but frankly, were worship icons for the most powerful people at the time, which was the priests and pastors of the day. And ultimately, ethically, it's confusing, isn't it? Today, would you be comfortable with billions of dollars being sent to an opulent church over feeding the hungry? Would you prefer an institution that does not allow women to have full and equal rights, that does not support the LGBT community, that does not support or get engaged with issues relating to freedom of consciousness or freedom of movement. And this question to me it's old when I put myself in those times, but it's no different today. We have to ask the same questions about our institutions and how much they are consciously or through negligence supporting institutions that oppress, and what we're doing to challenge those. And frankly, if our institutions are not going to change, we have to leave them or we have to change them. So that's my summary. You know, I slapped a sticker on my car this year for the organization I run, and the fact that I had to think about whether my car was going to be vandalized or not, or whether I'd be targeted for a hate crime. The fact when I worked in Atheist Campaign in 2014, we joked about if we'd prefer a bullet or a brick coming through our front window if we were to be attacked. The fact that I know people in the atheist community that don't speak without bulletproof vests. Like, we have so much work to do. So thank you for your time. I'll take questions. We can hang out for a while. But yeah, thank you. And I didn't even get into stories of a lot of people in my community today. But this is just my perspective on religious power, privilege, and pain. Cool.
Thank you so much, Evan. Do you want to end the share screen so we can
Sure.
maybe just for the discussion?
Stop. Yep. Let's do it.
Great. Awesome. So I'm going to open it up for questions. You can unmute yourself, or if you want to type a question in the chat, you're welcome to do that as well. Richard? Sorry.
I just was saying hi to him.
Oh, okay. William? Vern? One of you want to go?
Yes.
Okay.
So Evan, why do you think that the country that so strongly put forward the concept of separation in government and religion has, of the quote unquote developed countries in the world, has become the most religious, with apparently something like 30 or 40% who believe in like literal biblical conceptions of the origin of the planet and so forth and so on?
Oh yeah. Belief in angels is like wildly high compared to other countries. If we're getting into other examples, yeah, there's a few theories out there about this. Some argue the way, frankly, religion actually always held a little bit more influence in our institutions than others. Though we prided ourselves on separation of religion and government, frankly, it was still always there. You know, if you were to go back to the 1800s, you'd still be asked what church you go to if you were introduced to most people, like you are in the South today. There's another argument that we were a much more rural country, and so we were able to provide and prioritize essentially much more diverse traditions and individualistic perspectives on religion, where they got much more tied up with the state. And so when state's power was challenged, religious power was challenged in some European areas. There's also some argument that, frankly, the amount and diversity of religion in the United States helped. So in Italy, for instance, if you're not a Catholic, what are you? Well, there's not many options. And so a lot of people, it was much easier to go to atheism or paganism in a way where in the United States, there's essentially 100 different stepladders you can take for trying different religions, and people wound up in other religious institutions. So I don't personally have the answer. I do think I have okay answers for why I think that's starting to change very quickly, though, not just around the world, but in the United States. I think the rise of the internet had a huge influence in giving people access to information that they never had before. You know, you've probably all heard the studies on the youth generation. Millennials or younger are the most secular generation in American history. Almost 1 in 5 of them don't identify as religious. 1 in 4 of them often in cities. On college campuses, the numbers are getting close to 1 in 2 on some institutions. So we are seeing this wild outgrowth of irreligion and non-theism and secular identities. But at the same time, it's also not straight atheism and agnosticism. So like, I do want to also challenge, there's a lot of belief in supernatural or concepts of God or gods or higher powers, even if they're not traditional religious ideas. And that'll be fascinating to see how that interacts with government. So, you know, we don't have astrologers running the country the way we have Christian nationalists running the country, but it'd be fascinating to see what happens when that happens, and if they will try to like claim that astrology values are the only values that matter in law or something, the way like Mike Pompeo talks. And then I forgot to mention 9/11, I think had a huge influence on our culture. I think that helped inspire a lot of secular and atheist authors to speak up and critique religion. So critiques of religion have gotten platforms in ways they just never could before. And the internet has also connected communities in ways they never could before. So it's not just online communities. You kind of see the rise of physical atheist communities over the past 20 years in ways you just never saw before that. And so in every major city in the United States today, we have an atheist or humanist community, if not multiple atheist and humanist communities. In Los Angeles, I think we have like 5 or 6 active atheist or humanist communities, 2 of which have staff members, which I know is small in religious terms, but in atheist world, like that is massive. You know, that's incredible. Now we can talk about raising children. We could talk about youth education, you know, domains that were almost exclusively held by religious institutions outside of our government programs.
Thank you, Vern. I think you had your hand up.
Yes, several qualifications. First of all, religion was not disestablished in the United States in 1776 or in 1789. It was disestablished on a federal level, but it continued on a state level well into the 1800s.
It's true.
Secondly, in the period that some of those beautiful churches were constructed in Europe, there was no notion of sexual orientation. And as a matter of fact, churches conducted same-sex rituals, which are very much like modern weddings, including the kiss, the reading of scripture, and the exchanging of rings. So that's part of the history that I think needs to be uncovered. But
sure.
The qualification—
Maybe I should have focused on slavery instead. I'm sorry.
The most serious qualification that I really need help with is the word religion itself, which is an Enlightenment category. The Enlightenment wanted to put everything into boxes. And so religion was invented. Almost no what we call a world religion even has a word for religion. So it's very difficult when you're looking at different cultures, and certainly at our own, to get clear about the relationship between culture and religion. Well, I wholeheartedly agree with you that government should be secular in the sense that one set of laws should apply to all people, and no religious establishment should be preferred. I'm in complete agreement with your goals. I really need help in trying to distinguish and to tease out the difference between what we are now calling religion from the a more accurate and pre-Enlightenment understanding of culture.
Yeah, and again, I'm not an academic, I'm an activist. So I'm going to give more of my perspective that are more cultural definitions probably than hyper specific academic definitions. But my understanding of the 2 major definitions of religion today that are used in community circles or sociology circles are one, and this one's often most embraced by the atheist community, which is religion is a group of people or ritual-based community that has a belief in a higher power or supernatural concepts. Maybe they attribute values to that or not. And then the second being just a group of people that gather regularly for shared identity, or beliefs. In which case, like a sorority is a religion. A bowling team could be a religion. And I find this really fascinating because I think there's value to using both in different contexts sometimes, but it's not very useful culturally when we talk about religion, and everybody kind of has their own idea. So I think culturally, most of us, when we use the word religion, and why most secular people honestly identify as non-religious, even if that's an imperfect term, is because the association of religion and some level of supernatural idea or higher power or unnatural concept is so embedded in our cultural definitions of religion. But I actually do think the sociological definitions are much stronger, which don't need the higher power. I do think most of the work I'm doing, which is an atheist group that meets on Sunday, has a speaker, we talk about our values, we eat food together, like we look and feel way more like a religion than the local library does. And I think it makes a lot of sense for sociologists to describe what we're doing in religious contexts, or for us to be studied in the same way that you would study religious traditions, even if, we wouldn't use the language internally. And a lot of people in my community have been so traumatized and hurt by religion that they reject the label out of pain and suffering. They need new language that they don't want to that they can identify with comfortably. So what's fascinating is most atheist communities, rightfully or wrongfully, have a tinge of anti-theism, and this comes from the fact that there's so much trauma from so many of the members' past experiences. They were lied to about their sex education, or they gave a ton of money and effort to something they no longer believe in. They were told about whether it be the afterlife or how they will do in life, or that this is meaning and hope will come from these places, and they feel completely duped now that they no longer believe in those things. So whether we should keep the word religion or reject the word religion is really hard. Where culturally, I completely get the argument for rejecting it. Emotionally, I get the reason for rejecting it. But if I was a sociology researcher, I would call my community a religion.
Rin, did you have anything to add, or no? Okay. Does anyone else have
Thank
any?
you.
Does anyone else have any? Ron, do you have a question?
I just have one simple question. I noticed Evan was using the word humanist, in place of, or the same thing as atheist. Is that another term for atheist? Or an atheist is a humanist?
It's a little more complicated. So atheism and atheist being the lack of belief in God. Most people who lack a belief in God or gods, they identify as atheist, right? So you're asking the question about the concept of God, then the lack of belief or disbelief would be atheist. Agnostic being a different question, which is how much confidence or intensity you believe in that. And then humanist is more a question of what you do believe. And so humanist is an atheist concept. Like, we start from the belief that God doesn't exist, but you could be a Nazi atheist, you could be a humanist atheist. There really doesn't tell you about anything about the person other than the lack of belief in God. Humanism is a worldview that's become really popular in the past 150 years. I think it really came out of the Unitarian tradition in a lot of ways, that basically is a progressive worldview that says, okay, we want to understand the natural world. What's the best way to understand that? It seems like science is the best tool we've come up with understanding that. And so we use science and reasoning as our tool for understanding the world. It asks questions about ethics. Okay, well, how much responsibility do I have to the other people around me? Well, we look at the natural world and we see that we're all interconnected through this shared ecosystem, and that we have more in common with humans than different by virtue of being human. and there are essentially shared responsibilities that can or should come from that. And using reason and science, we look for the best ways to do that. Looking at the natural world from an atheist perspective, we would say this is our one life and our only life. And so we kind of have no choice but to live it to the fullest if we decide suffering is the ultimate evil or the worst thing we can come up with. There are, again, scholars and academics who speak much better about what humanism is than I do. But it is kind of the positive worldview that a lot of atheists identify with and a lot of organizations identify with. And so if I were to talk about it from a movement and activist perspective, I would say there's different movements. So there's an atheist movement, which is a resistance movement often to religious power and privilege. We try to be the first line of defense against religious power and influence, and frankly, protecting the atheist community, which should be one of the most marginalized by religious privilege. We're protecting all religious minority identities. And then second, but like a resistance movements don't need to exist beyond their resistance. Really, they exist
Right.
to respond to something. A humanist movement is trying to define what type of world we would build from our perspective and a set of shared values that that group of people has come together around. Not all atheists are humanists, but almost all humanists are atheists.
Okay, not all atheists.
Yeah.
Well,
And honestly, it's weird because the word humanist just isn't a popular identity. Like people like me and Richard, who's on this call, like we've studied atheism and humanism to some extent. We've read a lot of books, we've watched a lot of talks, and so we identify strongly with this tradition and worldview of humanism that has been popularized for the past 150 years. But a lot of atheists, they just left religion in the past 10 years or so, or they're just discovering that there are identities other than the religious identity they had. And the first label almost all of them find, like myself when I was young, is atheist. We figure out the rejectionist label. It's the first one. It's the most popular one. There's studies by American atheists that shows that's still the most popular label by most in our community. But there are organizations like American Humanist Association, which are almost 100 years old, who have been doing work, frankly, from an atheist perspective with humanist values. That's one other way to think about it. Like, what would the values be from atheism? Like maybe I could argue freedom. But beyond that, it kind of gets hard to argue that there's like values that can attach to a lack of belief in something. But humanism, being a positive belief system, has its own value set.
thank you so much.
Yeah, no
You
problem.
talked really fast, but that thank you. That does help. Very helpful. Thank you.
Were there more questions? Ron, did you have a question? I think you had your hand up before.
Me?
You're muted. You have to unmute yourself, Ron.
I'll make a quick comment while Ron's doing that. Somebody mentioned in the chat, humanism, I'm describing as secular humanism. That's true. There are religious humanist traditions. What we find is most humanist traditions and understanding, especially in modern United States, are secular. There's no real hyper-organized religious humanist movement. And humanism, being secular in its thought process about the natural world, kind of always generally concludes an atheistic secular perspective in most cases. And so most humanists don't use the phrase secular humanist anymore. We have claimed humanist as a secular label. And there isn't too much debate anymore between religious humanists and secular humanists. Usually religious humanists are holding on to religious traditions, but they are secular in their beliefs, which is a fascinating distinction we could give a whole other talk on, like Jewish humanists and other identity groups like that. But usually they're not holding on to supernatural beliefs. They have secular beliefs, but they happen to have religious traditions or identities.
Oh.
Clarification. I think Ron.
Okay, looks like Ron unmuted himself. Are you there?
Yes. Highly recommended is Catherine Stewart's book,
Yes.
The Power Worshippers Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism.
Yes, that's a great question. Yeah, if you haven't read that yet, I highly recommend it. She writes another book about the Good News Club, which is a evangelical youth group program that was created 20 years ago, that got approved by the Supreme Court to allow basically Bible studies for evangelical children, basically evangelical conversion youth groups for elementary school students. And you can use the same space, which is the campus. You can use the same classrooms, and you can even use the same teachers that the students just had a few hours earlier. And they found that these have been very effective at converting young people to evangelical Christianity. Now, one of the benefits of that law, and the only thing we have left that can fight that, is it allows all other religious traditions and identities to get in. So you've noticed the Satanists have started an after-school program. There's some atheist communities that have started after-school programs. So the Satanists have actually probably been the best in the country at challenging the far right's definition of religious freedom, which usually means privileging Christianity. And they've proven that when you take an identity that they don't actually want to be privileged and you say we have to get same and equal access and opportunity based on the law you created, suddenly everybody flips and the Satanists aren't allowed, and then suddenly no one's allowed, which is how it should have been to begin with.
Dorothy, did you have a question?
Yes, I did. I'm an agnostic, and I was particularly interested, and I think you are an academic, whether you think you are or not.
Sure.
But I was really interested in understanding what you meant when you said you don't have to share beliefs to appreciate the culture.
Yes.
I don't know what culture you're talking about. I don't know how to define that culture.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm stealing the word culture in a lot of ways. People don't always attribute culture to religious traditions. I think maybe we can and should in some ways. Like, can you separate the music of the certain areas from like the religious music that comes from certain areas and the people of that area at some point? Like, there are musical traditions, there are art traditions, there are architecture traditions that we attribute essentially to certain religions at this point. Again, it's a grouping of people that do something together. If it was a soccer group that built these really beautiful soccer stadiums or something, maybe I'd be excited about the culture of like soccer from 200 years ago. But I'm kind of attributing like Catholic architecture, I find very beautiful and fascinating, that a lot of people do. I find like, let me think, Jamaican art traditions with the Rastafarian tradition. Like there's so many beautiful intersections between religion and culture that essentially when I'm describing culture, I kind of can't separate the religion from it. And in some ways, I kind of want to have the same conversations about the atheist community. Like, we have a choir who's been creating their own music in Los Angeles for 15 years now. We have one of the only atheist choirs in the world. I think one of 3 major atheist choirs. And at what point are we a part of the culture of Los Angeles? We have been organizing regularly, bringing people together, bonding community, and putting art out into the world. Can I attribute that to the religious tradition, or is that just to the individuals that participated? And most sociologists, at least, like, we try to define them attached to, I think, the larger institutions, whether we should or shouldn't. And so that's what I'm usually describing in that sense. Like, I think when we think of Mormon communities and like raising children together, like the way there's a proximity that's created in a lot of Mormon communities where they spend so much time together and the focus on raising children is so acute. You could look at that maybe as a beautiful aspect of culture. I personally think there's a lot of other toxic elements that come with that, but there are things that maybe they've been doing together for so long that we can call kind of the Mormon culture in America, or tradition that goes with that.
Okay, I have one more question about the science that you mentioned.
Sure.
You mentioned that you were bothered by how medical science was ignored.
Yes.
Are you also bothered by how religion just ignores science?
Yes, of course. And we should be, right? The extent to where we should care about this is the fascinating ethical question. But yes, in the base sense, the reason we need to be having conversation about religious privilege in our institutions is because child marriage is still legal in most states in the United States. It's because faith healing is still considered a medical practice, and you can get off for killing your child based on faith healing in California even. And I can't press criminal charges against you the same way I would if you were atheist and you were trying to do secular medicine. But yes, this extends to even evolution being taught in schools, which was one of the biggest issues of the atheist community for the past 50 years. Ever since the Scopes monkey trial, we've been having this conversation about, what level and extent, and the religious right has been pushing back against it. We have to protect scientific integrity in our institutions. And ultimately, because it's the secular way to grow a society, it's the one thing we all can agree on. If you used faith-based reasoning to argue why you think this dam's going to work, and I use faith-based reasoning to say this dam isn't going to work, and someone else used faith-based reasoning to say the river is going to magically dry up and float away anyways, and we don't have to worry about it, like, to prove who is true, it's a useless conversation. It's all faith-based. We have to come up with evidence-based solutions and evidence-based thinking for us to work together as a society. And science is the best tool we've come up with yet, because it adapts based on new information, and it's based on data and evidence. I'm not saying it has to be perfect, but as a tool, not as an answer, as a tool, it's the best tool we've come up with as human beings for understanding the natural world. The unnatural world and answering questions about that, you can't use science because it's not a scientific question. What is love? What is going to happen after you die? What came before the universe? Like, those aren't scientific questions generally. So it's okay to not apply science in that case. But when it comes to whether we evolved from common ancestors of apes, or we like magically popped into existence because God had a headache, like, yeah, we can't just leave that to those that have dogma as their first choice. I didn't quite get to this in my talk. I'm actually realizing I missed a few of my notes, but we have to fight dogmatism. Ultimately, I think this is where I am asking for religious help. The secular community has been one of the best at this for years, but our religious allies, even our progressive religious allies that agree with us on most issues, have struggled to boldly stand up and challenge dogmatism in all of its forms. Faith-based reasoning as a solution to world problems. Many people still think of thoughts and prayers essentially as a way to push back or change the world. And it is not a solution that is inclusive or works. We have to bring critical inquiry into every conversation. And if your religion and religious tradition can't hold up to critical inquiry, we do not share the same values. And you are probably standing more with the religious nationalists than myself on those issues.
Thank you. That was brilliant.
Do we have any more questions? Evan, I don't know how long you had in terms of time. Did you want to go to?
My next call's at 2. I'll hang out.
Okay.
Could
William?
someone put or type in the that recommended book that the gentleman suggested? All I got was Catherine. I'd like to know the name of the book.
Sure.
Could someone type it in that little chat box? I could catch it, please.
I think he's on it.
Okay, let me.
Other questions?
Yeah, Evan, I wanted to ask you.
Thank you. The Power Worshipper? No, there it is. Okay, thank you.
I wanted to ask you, some of the religiosity that's happened in America, especially the sort of officially expressed governmental religiosity, comes out of the Cold War, when we never used the word communism without calling it godless communism.
Right.
And so, are you in favor of, or do you actually push for, say, removing
communism?
under God, which was inserted between one nation and indivisible in the Pledge of Allegiance, or the national motto, "In God We Trust," which actually sort of alienates maybe a quarter of the nation, if not more?
Yeah, so "In God We Trust" was added in the 1950s, if you don't know, to our money, and became the national motto of the United States. It replaced "E pluribus unum," which I think is one of the most beautiful lines we've ever come up with for a country, which means from many one, I believe. Yeah, I mean, it's quite obvious. I've never met an atheist in any of my communities that doesn't oppose "In God We Trust" as the national anthem, as it was added to the Pledge of Allegiance. These were all Christian propaganda techniques to, like, what you see in Project Blitz now is it's actually part of a longer term strategy. So you notice Kentucky was one of the states that passed a law in the past year that said you now have to require the national motto, "In God We Trust," to be put in every classroom in the state. And the reason they do that is that we actually uncovered, the atheist community uncovered their playbook. They want to slowly chip away at our concept that there is a separation between religion and state, so that they can someday start inserting Christian religion into institutions of power, such as our government. And we've seen different ways they've like warped language in order to do this over the years through propaganda campaigns, like the concept of family values or the concept of religious freedom. But it's really insidious, actually, the way you slowly use language, this Orwellian trick of slowly using language to get people to normalize the way you talk about the world. And then in the other part of culture, you're defining God to mean the Christian evangelical God. And so, yes, we have to oppose that. It is not inclusive of at least a fourth of Americans. It is referring to the evangelical Christian God almost always. Again, walk into Kentucky evangelical church and encourage them to put, "In Allah we trust" on their wall, and they will kick you out of the place. Like, we know that they do not mean all gods. So it is not a secular phrase, no matter how much the courts argue that. But I think there's a larger question from a movement perspective, which I'm going to always try to bring it back to, about urgency and where we should put our resources and time. And what we found is for the past 30, 40 years, the humanist and atheist communities have been very aggressively trying to challenge these, especially in the courts. And we've made a lot of successes, but now, especially with the Trump administration and the new Supreme Court, we are going to be on the defense for separation of church and state cases for the next possibly 30 years. We do not have a runway for winning a lot of these cases. And so actually, if we were to take on too many of these cases too strong, you set bad law. Essentially, we will be fighting an uphill battle for the rest of our lives. So what I like, actually, is that a lot of the conversations are moving to places that religion has always been influencing people's lives and well-beings through the law, and frankly has been hurting people much more than "In God We Trust" on the money, which is women's access to abortion, which is LGBT community, which is conversion therapy camps, which is Catholic hospitals and restricting access to certain medical procedures, which is child marriage, which is faith healing, which is sex education programs, which is evolution teaching in our schools. We have a plethora of actually very intense human rights issues that we can address that the most privileged religious traditions have always taken the other side of. Even our recovery programs, our alcohol and drug recovery programs, are overwhelmingly religious in the United States. And when they are challenged by secular evidence-based programs, they don't get access to the same resources. So you'll find that most judges in the United States and most state legislatures will fund programs like Alcohol Anonymous, which comes from a Christian religious tradition, emphasizes belief in a higher power, and often is intertwined with church congregations. And we're not seeing the same access and funding for secular alternatives. So yeah, I think there's a lot of work to be done. I would love for In God We Trust to be off the money and the pledge to go back to when Looney Tunes was doing it right in the 1930s. But I also just don't think that's the fight I'm going to be having for the next 30 years. I think I'm going to be talking about faith healing, child marriage. We're going to be stopping the religious right from keeping encroaching into our schools. Honestly, there's a whole conversation we haven't even got to about the intersection right now between the Christian religious right and the anti-climate change movement. And they've been in bed for a while and people aren't talking about it enough, and how there's a lot of religious language now getting into the anti-climate change movement. Environmentalists have actually always had a critique of religion and how people use the belief that I will go to heaven after God made this perfect world for us and I will go to heaven afterwards. So you don't actually have to worry about the world, is a critique that environmentalists have always made of religious reasoning in environmental conversations. You're seeing that on hyperdrive right now with the religious right and kind of this intersection between white nationalism and the oil industry. And it's really terrifying, frankly, because now we're not talking about just like our community thriving. We're talking about saving the world, like literally saving the world. I want you to put on your superhero suit and help us save the world by fighting back against the religious right here.
Thank you, Evan. I guess we can go till about past. That would give us another 6 minutes or so. Does anyone have any final questions or comments? If you could just raise your hand so I can see you. Amber?
Yeah. Evan, thank you so much for your talk. You talked about some progressive religious allies. I'm wondering who they are. I came from the Seventh-day Adventist religious tradition, and at one point, I think the faith had a very strong sense of separation of church and state, kind of identifying themselves or ourselves as a religious minority within Protestantism. But I haven't been plugged into the community for a while, but my understanding is that that's starting to erode too, in particular among the white Seventh-day Adventist community, that the things that they used to push back against, they're no longer pushing back against.
Right.
And sort of old school Baptists were once very much strongly in favor of separation. Jimmy Carter was one of those Baptists, from my understanding. So what are you seeing in terms of your religious allies? Who are they? What are the shifts that you've seen?
And this is two-sided. So the atheist community, for all the things I will praise it for, it has had many issues where we have been more of a resistance movement, and we've started from an anti-theist perspective. Some of the most popular authors in the atheist and humanist circles have critiqued religion first and foremost, and they believe that irrational thought is the most dangerous concept, and religion is the king of irrational thought. I think this is a poor and wrong premise. I think this is based on the idea that people have complete autonomy and individual will over their ideas, and that as individual actors, we make such great decision. And there's this like uber rational man that we aspire to, which is like the European Enlightenment concept, which is like we're still living in the shadow of European Christian white thought. Like we're still stuck there. So frankly, I'm still having this challenge of waking up the secular communities to this idea that like we don't have to follow, just because you critique one thing doesn't mean you have to stop and not critique all of the other things that might be wrong as well. And a lot of atheist communities just got very stuck on religion being the one wrong thing, and they couldn't see any interconnection between like atheist issues and maybe white nationalism or LGBT issues or women's right to choose. And these have always been interconnected issues if you care about suffering, if you care about freedom. So moving the value proposition from just atheist as equal to all people living and thriving, that's a huge transition we're making in our community, and that's made us resistant to interfaith cooperation. We would start from a place of, you are part of the problem, and so why would we work with you? And we've gotten much better. We've had this new generation of leaders that's come in. We've found interfaith allies that, again, this is a critique of interfaith communities too, have also been very hesitant. Why would we invite the people who don't believe even the word faith to an interfaith conversation? Yeah, and we've had to work out for years what it means to actually come together and what our shared values are that we can work together on. And ultimately, what we need is more pluralism. We have to agree on the future we're fighting for, and that is a pluralistic society. But we have different visions of that. And I think there's still a level of atheist thought supremacy or Christian thought supremacy or Jewish thought supremacy where I'll work with these people, but once we get equality, I hope we win. And we have to get over that. We have to accept that people are going to have different beliefs than ours, and there's no winning, and it's not about winning. It's about us having equal access to opportunity and equality. Beyond that, I do think there's some good interfaith allies, and I've focused more probably on leaders than communities. We're still new to the game of social justice issues. We've been so focused on just separation of church and state from our hyper-focused lens. And when other communities are like, yeah, but we're solving hunger, or yeah, but we're involved in international refugee programs, they don't get why that's our urgency problem. So I do think a lot of communities, we come at things with different urgency, and we need to convince each other that both of our issues can be of higher urgency, and we should work together on those. And this is why I give talks like this. I do believe more religious communities need to heighten the urgency of church-state separation, of religious privilege as a part of our society, of harm religious institutions are capable of doing when they're well organized. But we also have to start from the belief that institutions cause harm, large governments, large companies, and large religions are capable of huge amount of harm. It's not about any one person. An atheist community can do child abuse like the Catholic Church someday. We're not incapable of that. So anyways, but I think your question was more focused on how we take organizations like the Seventh-day Adventist and how they are maybe pro separation of church and state in some instances and how we work with them. I think the larger conversation is going to be how we build maybe more of a pluralistic movement with them. Because while generally we can agree, it doesn't mean you want to go help the atheists. We've found, the Muslim community has worked really hard over the past 30 years to get people to pay attention when they're being persecuted. And liberal communities are now coming around to oh, right, we have to back these people up, because if one of us gets pushed back, we all get pushed back. We've been talking about that with Jewish communities for a long time in the United States. I think these are ongoing conversations we're always going to have about the Jewish and Muslim communities. We have not been having those conversations with the atheist community. And I want to say half the people in my community still don't talk to their family members about their identity. Some have been shunned or kicked out of their houses. Some have lost jobs. Some have lost marriages. Some fear violence. I do not just walk into Kentucky with a big atheist sticker on my head. It's not, I'm not trying to compare it to being a Black trans woman in Kentucky, let's say, but I do think we need to have conversations about how we need to extend this beyond just our comfort zone. We have to be willing to get in the mud together and decide we're in this together against our persecutor. And I don't feel like we've fully done that yet. Part of that's relationship building. It's classic politics. We all need to get in the room together and talk it out. It's an investment. You have to come visit my community. I have to go visit your community. But then it'll be interesting to see how we build a movement around that, whether it be institutions like massive NGOs, whether it be lobbyists, because the religious right has gotten so organized and so well funded, and they are so excited to oppress us in so many different places, that if we don't come together, like they're just going to knock each of us off one at a time. So like the Muslim ban, we have to all come together against that. The attack on synagogues, we all have to come together against. That's my personal perspective on it. I think this approach the religious right came up with and how they partnered with capitalists, which is, I know we're not all going to agree on the future, but we're not going to let anyone be pushed backwards. We're going to draw a line in the sand, and we all are going to like hold that line together because we need each other politically. Again, like I know we have different futures. I know my good Muslim friends like picture a different future than me. They have different buildings and ideas of education and language and how to raise children, and that's okay. But they shouldn't be persecuted because of that, and I shouldn't be persecuted because of that. I think that's probably the biggest point I want to get through to leaders of different religious communities. But you know, I still like, I've spoken at interfaith things, and it's fear when I show up. Like it's insecurity about your beliefs, and like we got to get over all that. I don't care what you believe. You shouldn't care what I believe. Have confidence in what you believe. If you can't handle a few questions, I don't know what game you're in. I don't know why you're trying to be a pastor. Yeah.
Thank you. I actually think that might be a good ending point for us if there are no more final questions or comments. I know we're running about an hour and a half right now, so and everyone loses everyone gets Zoom fatigue. So just want to be mindful of Evan's time and everyone who's remained on the call. And I hope you'll consider the Interfaith Center an ally. I think that we have, you know, a shared vision of, you know, cooperation and shared common humanity. So I want to thank you all for participating today and for joining us, and Evan for your time. Open it up. Just any final. Did you want to give a closing thought, Evan, or if anyone has any closing?
No, I do want to thank you all, because I think this is what it takes. It takes engagement. It takes vulnerable engagement, and especially working with the atheist community, which we're new to this, and you all are new to working with us in a lot of cases. There's groups like maybe this one that have been working with them a lot closer for a lot longer. But yeah, I went to an interfaith retreat. There was a woman who's trying to organize interfaith retreats. She wants to become a like interfaith life coach, like the first interfaith life coach. And she organized this beautiful retreat. There was about 12 of us. We went maybe, I don't know, like, 4 hours one day, 8 hours the next day, 4 hours the next day. And there's this one woman who's very like spiritual, but not religious, maybe woo, like Miriam Williamson type beliefs. And I remember she started engaging with me about atheism, because we kind of created space for that. But it was not like a, hey, I'm honestly excited to hear what you believe. It was, I want you to defend atheism against these critiques. It was like, I think atheism is this. I think it's wrong because of this, and I want you to respond because of this. And this is typical. This is how we have had conversations with people of different religious identities for centuries. And this has to change, because it's anti-pluralist. We have to engage people as equals. We have to say, even if I ethically disagree or emotionally or whatever disagree with the belief you have chosen, if there are values that overline, I will work with you on those. Don't compromise anything about your current beliefs or your values. But, by the end of that day, we were able to get to the place where I could confront that you didn't make me comfortable. This is not a comfortable space. You didn't, the minority problem is you're always on the defense, and you always have to speak for the millions of people you represent when you step into those spaces. And no one person should ever have to speak for a million people. And this is the challenge, right? Like, until we start putting atheists in these spaces, until we start taking some of these identities and traditions that haven't been platformed as much and giving them the same access and opportunity, we won't actually be living up to the values. I love the values of interfaith community, but it takes a lot of work for us to actually live up to them. So I want to thank you for trying to today and committing to that, and keep up the good work.
Thank you. I really appreciate those comments. And we actually have a atheist on our board of directors. So I think we're structured a little differently than a lot of interfaith organizations. And I've been in secular circles. I used to play music for Sunday Assembly, Las Vegas. That's actually where I saw you the first time. And I do think there's a mutual resistance sometimes where either religious people who feel excluded from atheist or secular humanist circles and atheists feel excluded from interfaith circles. And I hope that this is a step towards us kind of bridging some of those gaps. And I hope we, go ahead.
The best thing you can do is recognize that like not everyone shares your experience or excitement either, right? Like if white people walk into a Black community and like don't recognize the trauma that's been happening in that community because of white people, like, then you're not going to be able to have the conversation you want. And similarly, most atheists that I know in the United States have some level of trauma attached to religious communities and experiences. So we need to speak with care, and we need to give them space for that. A lot of secular communities are just spaces. Like if you want to talk about religion, go to an atheist community. We talk about religion more than any community I've ever been in my life. And it's because they're still like getting through what happened and understanding where their beliefs are today. So I do just want to like ask for patience and empathy. And if you give that, you will get it in return.
Absolutely. And I think that, I think I really appreciate you sort of sharing your story at the beginning of this. And I think that we need to share more stories. That's what's going to create that compassion and empathy towards one another. And I think that's a big thing of what we're trying to do here. Did someone have their hand up? Was it?
I did, Diane. Evan, I want to thank you. I attended a workshop a couple years ago, and it was led by an atheist group. And you'd mentioned that fear. Oh, yes, I had a lot of fear walking in there. It's like I could fill the room, but it was probably just me, because there were other, there was other maybe activists for a different thing. There was a nun there, and in different groups were talking. And I was part of some of those other groups, but we were there for a different purpose. So what I want to thank you for is dismantling some of that fear. And it really is the unknown. I know our church is becoming reconciling something or another so that the LGBTQ people will know they are safe when they come in there. And so I kind of see what you're doing as the same thing, or with our Black and brown brothers and sisters. That is our belief, or that is our private part. But I hear you saying, and for me, it's an extension of working with all the different groups for that common goal.
Right.
Is that what I hear you saying? That's what you're mostly about? I mean, other than your faith, but that's your personal.
Finding the shared values you can work together on, and holding dignity and respect for each other while doing it. I think is what I'm going for. Yeah.
Well, that's what I heard you say. So, but anyways, thank you. I'm sorry of my prejudice. We all have to kind of dismantle where we're at, but you've done that. You've taken some of that away, and I thank you for that and giving this talk.
Cool.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, and I'm glad that is one of the takeaways here. And so we're past the half hour now, so I'm just gonna say let's wrap it up. I appreciate everyone who hung around, your comments. Thank you so much to Evan. This was wonderful, and thanks to Cress and to Vern for co-sponsoring. And I hope that you all have a wonderful day, and I hope you'll join us again. And this was recorded, and we'll add it to our website if anybody wants to rewatch Evan's presentation or share it. So thank you all.
Thanks for organizing this.
Thank you.